Thank you very much, Anthony, and it's a great pleasure to be here. And Anthony and I do a lot of work, and we hope to continue to be doing even more work in the future. As Anthony mentioned, I was on a visit that was organised by Baroness Cox and also her second person, Andrew Ashdown, who's with us in the audience. We went to Syria in late April at the invitation of His Holiness More Ignatius Afram II, the Patriarch of the Syrian Orthodox Church. And the basic premise to visit Syria was to see the condition of the Christian and the Muslim communities, and as Heythrop has mentioned this morning, the necessity to hear what people are saying. And that was the whole raison d'etre of the visit. We're at the tomb of John the Baptist in the Umayyad Mosque. I love this picture. I think that's lovely. The mullah and the priest talking. So I'm going to give you a tour of what we did in Syria and the voices of people and some conclusions. Of course, you will all know Syria, but we went from Damascus to Homs and to Aleppo, up the western flank of the country. Of course, I needn't tell such a learned audience as this that Syria, if Christ is associated with Judea, Syria is really the birthplace of Christianity, in the fact, of course, that Paul walked down the straight street. Here you see the remnants of the Roman columns, and it was in Syria that the real impetus to the Gentiles took root. So although, of course, Jerusalem and the Holy Land is of course intricately associated with Christ, I think we can say that the real international impetus comes from Syria right from the very earliest times. And this is one of the reasons why Syria is so important for our knowledge and understanding of Christianity. Without Syria, where would have Christianity spread? Interestingly today, we have, and I will show you the slides, we of course have Christian military martyrs, men who are in conflict and die. Of course, back in the 3rd century, Rosaphe Sergiopolis on the Euphrates was dedicated to the cult of the military martyr saints Bacchus and Sergius, and attracted international acclaim, pilgrimages, etc. So again, Syria was internationally on the map in the Roman Empire. I'm not going to go through a trawl through the whole history of Christianity in Syria because we have another agenda, but just to say that from Roman times onwards, the embedding of Christianity, the international recognition of Christianity in Syria was already established. Of course, it is through the Bab al-Sharqi that in Damascus, the end of Straight Street, our hotel was a bit further up, was where Muslim forces first entered the city into a essentially Christian city. And of course, the presence of that religion has been very well established. I needn't say more. Here is His Holiness giving us a sermon, which he was very kind enough to deliver in English as well as Aramaic. The Syriac liturgy being very ancient, and Sebastian Brock has of course given us a very magisterial understanding of the place of the liturgy in the churches. And he preached his particular text on St. Thomas and the doubts, but he had the courage to put his hand in the wounds of Christ. And that gives you the message of it's necessary to have courage, as the Christians to have courage. And I hope to show in this lecture the ways that this courage is demonstrated. It was a very interesting interpretation of the doubting Thomas. On a flippant note, I want to know why Thomas was never present in all the occasions, what he was doing, something we don't know. So we had a meeting on the afternoon of the arrival with the Grand Mufti of Damascus, here in conversation with Emeritus Bishop Michael of Exeter. And what emerged from this meeting, yes, of course, it is a meeting of dignitaries, of figureheads, but there was a palpable sense of the communication between Muslims and Christians, an understanding of the mutuality of the two religions and their respective places within Syria. And here, of course, we are looking at that great symbol of Christianity that passed into the hands of Islam, and but still a recognition. This is a lineup. Here we have the baptistry within the great Umayyad mosque. The font within the great Umayyad mosque. So there is an implicit recognition of the place, the forerunner of Christianity to Islam. Of course, the mosque passed from shared worship into exclusive Muslim worship in the 8th century. I personally would love to see the conveyancing documents, but I don't think they'll be at hand. We also visited, the delegation visited select members of the Syrian parliament. The man on the right is the Speaker of the Parliament, and the chap with his hand to his nose was the Deputy Speaker. Quite a smattering of women parliamentarians, women well represented, Christian and Muslim, and we discussed various matters. And my interest was in pluralism and how the communities managed to cooperate, communicate together. And again, my impression was of a palpable sense of positivity, recognition of the respective places of the communities within Syria. And here is, on the right, she is the Armenian MP for Damascus. I like to think that's the Three Musketeers. Baroness Cox, of course, standing in the middle, and me looking very dishevelled on the right. So contrary, of course, to public expectation, quite a significant proportion of women in the parliament, and the parliament reflecting the different religious groups of the country. So that was was heartening to hear. And then we went on, and here is Munzer, of course, sitting in our audience, and Andrew. We went to meet the Minister of Religious Affairs, and again, the same conversation. And I did ask for and receive books which are the teaching of the curriculum on religions and pluralism in secondary schools, and which I have deposited in the University Library in Cambridge and also at SOAS. The one question that I would have asked the Minister, but I didn't at the time, I have to say I didn't realise this, is why the Ministry does not fund the rebuilding of churches. It does fund the rebuilding of mosques, if I'm correct, but does not refund the building of churches. That is done through the community. And as you will see, considerable efforts have been made. If they are truly pluralistic, one must ask, why isn't there an even-handed distribution of funds? But I didn't realise, so I didn't ask him that. But once again, the feeling that I received was, of course, that the communities respected each other, and they were respected in the Syrian society. We, of course, entered the night that Mr. Trump and Mrs. May decided to have a fireworks display in Damascus. We didn't see it. This is back from 2013 when the House of Lords issued this statement about the possible effects of military bombing on Syria, and particularly the Christians. And I don't think that, even though that's from 5 years ago, is, I think this has a particular pertinence today. Syria's Christians are in a frightening position, and their weakness and lack of protection could leave them as easy targets for Islamic extremists. And we all know, of course, since 2013, what has happened. The one point that came out repeatedly in our conversations with MPs and parliamentarians was the real concern expressed by moderate Muslims about the activities of extremists. So both communities equally concerned, understanding the vulnerability of their communities. And particular comment was made on the fact that rather than stemming extremism, Britain, through its funding of various groups whose configurations change, it's almost impossible to keep up with them, but particularly Jabhat al-Nusra is perhaps their figurehead, but by no means the only group, why Britain is funding such activities that are very destabilising to both communities. So they are united in this common stance of against extremism. We went on after the Sunday, we went up to Saidnaya and Malula, and here is a graphic symbol of how the Syrian Orthodox community is envisaging that it will stay in Syria and it will develop. And this is a university that is being, I think it's being opened in September. I think intake of about 200 students or 200 plus students, 4 faculties. I did ask whether they were going to teach Syriac, and they said no, it would be boring things like computer science and things like that. Because Syriac, but I don't think that's an adequate answer myself, could be taught at the seminary, but you might not want to learn Syriac in a seminary, as I wouldn't have as a young student. However, this is of course the seminary of Moa Ephraim, and on the left-hand side is the little onion shape is of course the shrine to the Saipho. Now the seminary trains of course clergy, and we met monks who had been kidnapped and taken hostage by Daesh and other forces, but also is very famous for the reliquary which holds the shred of the Holy Mantle. And I'm very proud to say that, and pleased to say that Munza's family were the donors that allowed this very important shrine. The Virgin's Girdle, which is associated with Homs, we have a little shrine here. These shrines tell us, this opening of this beautifully new sort of underground shrine tells us about hope for the future, efforts to keep the antiquity and the lineage and the heritage of the church going. Of course, remembering the Saipho, and this is one of the murals in a very large in the Saipho, in this shrine that I point out. So there's of course the martyrs of the sword, and you can see all the, and this is just a portion of a much larger mural. So we went on to Malula, and of course Malula was under occupation for 7 months, and this is a problem that Hratch already identified in his talk. People leaving, the lack of economic opportunity, And it's not only Christians, Muslim families leave, families that have had to flee, they go to Damascus, they go to Beirut, they find employment, they don't come back. How do you regenerate? So the university, of course, will provide a whole range of employment, from the professors to the cooks and cleaners, etc. Now, the worst devastation was at the monastery of St. Sergius and Bacchus, our military martyrs, dating back to the 4th century. I won't read that, but we will see the state of the church. It has been restored. So, but the icons are reproductions, because one of the things that is most telling is that the most precious icons were stolen. We don't know where they are. They'll be on the international art market, which probably never surfaces through auction houses. It goes through private hands. The altar table that you can just see is very unique. That was smashed but was able to be pieced together. That's dating back to the 4th century. So great care and loving attention to bring the church back. I mean, it must have been a heartbreaking task to do this, but it has been done. Here are the icons, the lesser quality icons that have had their faces scratched out, defaced in typical style. I have to say, my little parish church in Norfolk has a beautiful 15th century rood screen where the faces of all the saints are all scratched out, of course, in the Civil War. So this is, of course, the same sort of mentality. But but in a little side chapel, I discovered this gorgeous little baldachin made of wood, painted, and that must have been dismantled and taken away. Shows the people's pride. They have put it up, and there's just an example of one of the paintings on this exquisite wooden baldachin, which I think is probably 18th century. So what I am saying here is, despite all the destruction, the heartbreak, people have actively rallied to bring back the church, and that shows, of course, the centrality of the church in the community's mindset. We went on to Homs. I won't show you too many pictures of destruction because Heythrop showed that rather graphic video, but that's sort of typical. But I like this picture because, yes, it's all destroyed, but look, there's a tree growing. And that, to me, is a sign of regeneration, perhaps just symbolic. And people do. Little shops springing up. And this one was a particular favourite of mine. He was a florist. I think he was a florist. Maybe Andrew, he was a florist. And look, he has decorated. I think that's a sign of hope. And what I'm saying is this beautiful mansion that, of course, been bombed out. And here you have someone who's gone to considerable trouble to decorate and to bring a little bit of joy to very devastated streets. And I think that the Syrian people do show the capacity to come to regenerate themselves if they're given the chance. We went then to the monastery, the Syrian Orthodox headquarters in the old city of Homs, which was very, very heavily bombed. And that is, of course, where the girdle of Our Lady is actually housed, the little remnant being, or a little piece being taken to Sadnaya. And this is the church in black basalt. Fully restored again, you can see, I mean, it's very dense, the black basalt, but that's not conflagration, that is the stone. Again, bringing back the church into life. And here is an ante-room or a side room, and that shows you what was the condition before the restoration. So again, major work gone into bringing back the church into a living and a vital state. This is the sort of damage. You can see the mosque right next door to the church, and that was typical. Like in Mosul, you used to have the mosque next to the church. There wasn't a communal divide. That was around the patriarchal dwellings. You can see the sort of bomb damage that is just typical of old Homs. And that's Mefrem Barsoum, and even Mefrem Barsoum didn't escape the bullet marks. I actually rather like that image because I think it's so telling. You know, there's the patriarch, and his, they even got shot up at, and more damage around the church. So it just shows the efforts of bringing back the community to revitalise. We walked through the very heavily bomb-damaged streets to the grave of Father Franz, who was a Jesuit priest, and he was killed by a Jabhat al-Nusra gunman. His life was devoted to caring for both Christians and Muslims. Again, superseding religious divide, a man who responded to humanity, to anyone who needed his assistance. And the gunman just took him out and shot him. I think that was one of the most evil acts in a very evil set of circumstances. We were told that there was no priest in Homs. He was the last person there, religious person there, to conduct his funeral, and the instructions had to be conveyed by mobile phone. A man who gave his life to both Christians and Muslims, and there are countless examples of that. This is the Greek Melkite church, which again has been restored. I have seen photos of the bombing areas, and you can see this is, was heavily damaged. And if I'm correct, and please do correct me if I'm wrong, those who are there, I understood that the brother of the priest, before it was restored, walked into the territory and he was blown up. And because that is one of the problems Hatch talked about, reconstruction, restoration, just the whole question of mined areas is, and here again is typical. We've gone now further on north to Aleppo, and again a typical scenes of destruction in East Aleppo. But some of us, while some of the delegation went to see the Umayyad Mosque, some of us went to visit the Armenian Evangelical Church in Aleppo, which is in fine condition. And one of the things that you do see in Syria is the cross is clearly displayed. There's no shame in the cross being displayed. And unlike places like Kuwait, where you can have churches but you don't display the religious symbolism publicly, here, of course, in Syria, in all cities. Again, a memorial to the martyrs, this time, of course, the Armenian genocide. So rather like every English village has its memorial to the First World War fallen and the Second World War fallen, here every church has a particular feature with the cipher. Now, Reverend Harutin Seliminian, who is the pastor of this church, which is very well supported by the Lutheran Church. So the Lutheran Church is giving much support. He has established medical clinics, and also here we have a dental clinic which is free, and as you can see, very well equipped. And we had a meeting with the women who, I suppose most of the men, or who knows what proportion of women were widows, because this is a real problem and will be a real problem for communities because so many men have died. But they asked all sorts of questions, and we had a long talk, and he said that of course there were various questions that were really worrying the Christians, and of course Afrin, northwest Syria, the Turkish armies strategy was very worrying to them. Again, this whole question which Heythrop raised earlier on is there going to be a déjà vu? Are circumstances going to repeat themselves? This whole fear of dislocation. And as he said, Syrian people have gained a solidarity through their suffering, and perhaps that is what brings the Christian and Muslim communities together, but they are loyal to the present government. But, as he said, would abide by legitimate elected change. So this is a very important statement, that they are they would be open to a democratic process, but it needs to be through what we might call the proper channels. And in his opinion, and I quote him, the Christians play the role of PH in Syria. Without them, there would be a grave imbalance. Now, he also talked quite considerably about how to retain the communities, and I thought that was a very important point. Polyclinics manned by 6 Muslim doctors. Again, there isn't a division. It's the humanity of people that is the common denominator. 6 polyclinics, because hospitals have been bombed, free dental clinic. Food boxes, 6 schools, so 4 in Aleppo, and scholarships. And of course, this is all funded by the Lutheran Church. Only 20% of evangelicals, and I think he's using evangelical in the sort of the Trinitarian sense, because the Lutheran Church is evangelical. 20% of evangelicals left compared to 50% of other communities. So support from lacking government support, and maybe they don't have the means. This is something I would have liked to have talked to the minister about, but didn't eventuate. If people have a supportive infrastructure, there is more of an incentive for them to stay. Of course, employment is a great stumbling block. University of Aleppo is operational, and some students go on to study in Armenia. So he was very, very forthright that by giving services and support to communities. So that is one way that expatriate diaspora communities, which they do already, can really, really sustain and support. And that's our meeting with Reverend Harutin, who actually came to Zoas in 2015 at the height of the Aleppo siege and told us about life in Aleppo. And life in Aleppo between 2015 and 2018 had improved quite considerably. Food prices, availability of goods. So that's our little delegation. And Baroness Cox, on behalf of her charity, gave tangible help in the form of solar lights, because whilst electricity has been restored to some degree in Aleppo, 3 hours on, 2 hours off, of course villages don't receive electricity. Generators are very expensive. Solar lights enable people to live. So this whole question of sustainability. We had a meeting in the evening, and one of the real clouds that still hangs over the Syrian Orthodox and the Greek Orthodox, and here you see the 2 archbishops of the respective communities, is of course more Gregorius of the Syrian Orthodox and Paul Yazigi of the Greek Orthodox, Syrian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, who were on their way to negotiate ransom of, I think, some kidnapped priests of their communities in 2013, on April the 22nd, 23rd, when they were kidnapped. Now, one of the members of our of the community whom we met wrote to me later, we've been in dialogue, to say he was actually on the mobile, talking with More Gregorios at 2:13 in the afternoon when it went dead, and then about a minute later, because More Gregorios apparently spoke in English on the mobile, and an Arabic message came through, and he realised that there was something had gone awry, and they haven't been heard of since. And they're well remembered. And here is, we had a meeting, and what you can see, although the picture isn't very good, you can see all the different denominations of clergy, so a great sense of ecumenicism, and of course the seat remembering More Gregorios, the vacant seat awaiting his return. And there has been no insight into his whereabouts, and His Holiness actually said to me when I asked him, he said, well, we get leads but they don't go anywhere, and there's been no ransom asked, which is of course the usual norm, because kidnapping is a very big business, it's an industry. Again at this meeting we had various people from all at the back. These are of course the ecclesiastical and the MP dignitaries, to be able to ask questions on all sorts of aspects of life. And one important point that came out was of course the suffering, and particularly the imbalance between the ratios of men and women. So many men have disappeared, died, and that it has a really grave prospect for the communities. On the way back to Damascus, again the usual site of rubble, and we went to visit one of the relief camps set up for the recently released people from East Ghouta, whom you can see there, and we had the chance to talk with the people. I sympathise with this man because I had a very bad accident some years ago, and I wondered about what sort of medical attention he had received. This poor chap, we hope. But of course he's a lucky one because he didn't lose his limbs. So many people, of course, have lost their limbs, and that really impairs their potential to work. This is just the sort of circumstances inside where people live while they are being rehoused. They have to be screened, and then they are rehoused. And of course everyone wants to go home, but where do they go to when your house has been bombed? That's a very important question. And that's the sort of washing facilities, and these are just typical of the sort of people. Many of them will not have met Christians before. And here, of course, Baroness Cox in the midst of all the ladies, who I think everyone's looking quite happy. But I want to go on. And here is a workforce which has been set up by the Syrian Orthodox Church of young Christian volunteers who go into the camps, who try to help. And again, probably, and I only say this on hearsay because I haven't actually spoken to them, probably it's for many of the Muslims who've come into the camps, it's the first time that they have really encountered an actual Christian presence. So one hopes that the charity and the mercy which Christians give them will have some impression, and again help to maintain the stable relations between communities. It's very easy in the economic turmoil. That's what extremism thrives on, is to have impoverishment, and so if you can have counter levers to it. I'll go back. And here I have to give this as an anecdote because I thought it was, she explains this woman that she had been in the camp and she'd lived on Bali, and her children's education was lacking. Of course, on a greater level, the poor education, as Fracture said, and this isn't just pertinent to the Christian communities, it's also for the Muslim communities and the greater intellectual strength of the country. if your teaching lapses and subsides, this is an ongoing problem. But I said to her, well, you know, she had about 4 little boys, and I said, well, what would you like your boys to be? And she said, Syrian army officers. And I said, wouldn't you like them to be doctors or engineers? And she was very adamant. But maybe she was just responding to the circumstances of her liberation. But she was very, very adamant they were going to be army officers. But the problem of education, the lapse in education, professors from Aleppo told us that they couldn't get materials for research because of the sanctions. Of course, that intellectual decline and demise only afflicts a country further, and we've seen from Kratz has shown us where Syria stands in the league table, so an intellectual diminution. And this is going further scenes. Here is is entering back through the Bab al-Sharqi is the Armenian Orthodox Church, and again, clearly the church has a visible presence in Syria. So what are the sort of, I've given you a bit of a cook's tour, what are the sort of sentiments that people said to us? Well, they did express their robust desire that the status quo of balanced, integrated communities be retained. They very much really got a very deep sense of the understanding of a pluralist society from Roman times, from pre-Roman times. They understood that there are different communities who live together, contribute to each other, and there is no need to have a homogeneous society. I got that message very clearly. I might say so even more than when I was in Iraq. Certainly Iraq post-2003. Now, they were very concerned that the UK government was actually promoting and fostering the emergence of extremist groups when it was purportedly saying we're aiding and abetting democracy. And their comment was, and I think that's a very real comment, that the extremist groups may have their differences, but they actually will amalgamate, and they have the universal, perhaps, mentality of intolerance to others, but their own brand of Islam, which is very serious for both Christian and moderate Muslim communities. And we actually, at some point in the delegation, and I can't remember quite where, and perhaps Andrew might be able to tell us, we did have a discussion whether Wahhabism was actually part of Islam, and the conclusion was no. Well, I have mentioned this to various colleagues of mine who said, well, actually Saudi was of course the birthplace, so perhaps Wahhabism is the actual expression of Islam. But be that as it may, the groups in Syria very concerned about intolerance. Now, here is something that is a bit of a shock to me, but it has already come up in Ratcher's talk. Many Christians, including very senior hierarchy in Syria, describes Europe as not being Christian because of the antithetical and unsympathetic stance of Western churches as they perceive, and they consider this to be very detrimental to their well-being. They see, they're not necessarily making any comment on the military activities of Russia, but they see Russia as the upholder of Christian values. And we've seen a little bit of that with the Patriarch Hilarion, etc. So they don't see a great support from the West. Having said that, Reverend Harut in Aleppo from the Evangelical Church, did say he received great support from the Lutherans. So that has to be a little bit tempered, but I think that's an overall perspective, and I do believe that that has been expressed by senior members of the Syrian Orthodox Church. A great disappointment in the perceived lack of response, and of course UK's alliance with America and Israel, that whole complexity that is at the background. They do not care for us. They felt abandoned by Europe, and so they've actually found more comfort with fellow, albeit moderate, Muslims. And I remember the many letters written by the Greek Catholic Patriarch Gregory Latham III, who really dwelt on the Arabness of his church and the proximity and the compatriousness of his church as an Arab church, and the appeal to common culture, etc. So, of course, Syrian identity being a common denominator. Very deep anguish on all sides about the possibility of ramifications from the one-off, thank God to date, missile attacks, and of course the bombing incursions into northwest Syria, which have of course a particular concern for Aleppo, which is so close to such activities. And I have to say, although of course we didn't go into that region, but I've had bulletins. The Syrian Christians in the Habur region are caught right in the midst of this fighting between government troops and rebel forces. And of course they're subject to the bombing campaigns of all. So the Christians in the northwest are very much affected. Both Christians and Muslims both said that they saw Syria as being, of course, what I've called the killing fields between antagonisms played out between major powers, with Israel in the background, but Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Turkey, and also Israel. Real desire on all levels to resume normal living. And this is where I think the churches and the mosques, we didn't go into any mosques, but we saw them from the outside, being rebuilt and refurbished. And so here you see the place of both Christianity and Islam as this focal point in both communities. And that, of course, says much more about theology as to sociology of the communities. An overall desire to restore normal living and reactivate industry. And to me, that is just such an important priority. The sanctions are perceived to be cruel, and of course, some partial lifting of sanctions would be a great priority. I think one can say generally, and of course there will be exceptions to the rule, that the Christians believe there is no viable alternative structure in which to place their confidence at the moment. They don't trust the rebel groups, they don't have their interests at heart, and this is what they share with the moderate Muslims. They don't have their interests at heart. They don't see a stable community being a result. If there were shades of difference in 2011 and immediately after that, the 7 years of war have probably crystallised these positions. They've very much they've seen Egypt and Libya to see whether their interests would be upheld, and they, I think, with quite rightly so, have the caution to doubt that their interests would be upheld. So, if I say the rebel configurations are seen to be very disruptive, destructive, and displacing of both Christian and moderate Muslim communities, the upset to the status quo. It may not be perfect, it certainly isn't perfect, but it allows a normality of life. And as an Iraqi once said to me, what's the point of going to get a loaf of bread if A, the loaf of bread isn't available, and B, even if it is, you can't walk down the street to get it. I thought that was a very pertinent comment. Now, the government of Assad receives support because in the perception of the Christians and those Muslims who we met, stability, security and safety. And that is key. The communities, be they Christian, be they Alawite, be they Druze, be they moderate Muslims, the stability and security and the survival of the community are key. And of course, the people are aware that the government has flaws, but these factors at the present outweigh alternatives. And I don't know how many of you saw the excellent two episodes filmed by Lise Doucet on Syria. And in one of the episodes, she asked the Russian ambassador, who should succeed President Assad, and he said, well, I keep hearing this, but I haven't ever heard of a viable alternative. And so echoing that thought, in the minds of or the mentality, of course we're speaking generally and there will be exceptions to the rule, the Christian and moderate Muslim communities do not see viable options. This would come, I think, with a restoration of economy where people can resume normal life. They can have the things we take for granted, water, electricity, etc., earning, etc. That will provide the matrix for a development of different types of government, which will one day arise. But at the moment, their whole raison d'etre is to survive. And I think that unites both Christian and moderate Muslim communities. And we've got a few minutes for questions, and I thank you for your attention.